Good evening, everyone. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's book talk for Paris Undercover, a wartime story of courage, friendship, and betrayal. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. And if you have questions for our speaker during the program tonight, please put those in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Matthew Goodman. Matthew Goodman is the author of 4 previous books of nonfiction. His book, 80 Days, Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland's History Making Race Around the World, was a national bestseller. His book, The City Game, Triumph, Scandal, and a Legendary Basketball Team, received the New York City Book Award and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Goodman has appeared on numerous national radio shows, including NPR's The Diane Rem Show, All Things Considered, and On the Media. You can purchase Paris Undercover, which I highly encourage everyone to do, at the link in the chat. Thank you all again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and for all of the important work that you do. And of course, thank you to everyone for being here tonight. I can't see anybody, I can't hear anybody, which is disconcerting, but I trust that you're out there, and I will act as such. As Isabel mentioned, I'm going to be speaking tonight about my recently published book, Paris Undercover. I think that I will spare everyone talking too long. So my plan is to talk for maybe about 35 minutes or so. And then I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have. And as Isabel said, feel free to put them in the chat. So the story of Paris Undercover is about 2 women named Etta Shiber and Kate Bonnefous. I should mention to start that this is a true story. I write what I refer to as narrative history, by which it's history told in a novelistic way, but nothing in it is made up. Everything in it is true, taken from historical documents and so forth. And I'm happy to talk more about where the information came from later on, if you'd like. So this is a true story. And I first encountered it probably about 5 years ago when I was reading an article in Smithsonian magazine that mentioned a woman named Etta Shiber, who, according to this article, had, with her friend Kitty, as she was called, had rescued 150 Allied servicemen. The 2 of them were living in Paris at the time in 1940. And when the Germans marched in to Paris, these 2 women created an escape line. Again, according to this article, created an escape line in which they sheltered these servicemen and then transported them out of occupied France to unoccupied France, and then from there eventually back to England. Well, and then it turned out that, according to this article, she had written a memoir about her experiences, which was called Paris Underground, which was published during the war in 1943 and had been a huge success. It had been a national bestseller. It had been on the New York Times bestseller list for 18 weeks. It had been excerpted in Reader's Digest. A Hollywood movie was made from it. It was a huge success. And I was, fascinated by this notion. First of all, I had never heard of either of these two women. And I was fascinated to discover that they were not your typical young, glamorous, sexy spies. They were not Mata Hari types, these two. They were not, La Femme Nikita or Killing Eve or something like that. These were two older women. In fact, they were routinely referred to as elderly. It turned out, as I discovered, one was 58 and the other was 62, which of course I resented. They're being called elderly, but there you were. They were two ordinary older women living apparently conventional lives, living together as friends in an apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. And somehow they had managed to find the inner resources to resist when the time came. They were most unlikely heroines. But I knew beyond that, I knew very little about them. I read Etta's memoir, and it was great. It was exciting. It was dramatic. It was full of all of these sort of Hitchcockian cat and mouse escapades, fooling the Gestapo and so forth. And I thought, this is great. This is going to be the topic for my next book. So then I had to undertake to try to figure out all of the details of this story, because in Etta's memoir, which again was published during the war, all of the characters in the book, except for Etta herself, were given pseudonyms because the publishers presumably did not want to give any aid of intelligence to the Nazis about the people and the situations that were described in the book. So I didn't even know the real identities of any of these people, including her friend, Kate Bonnefous, as it turns out, was her name. In the book, she's called Kitty Beaurepos. So that was my first task, to try to identify who these women were. And over time, I was able to identify these two women and their 6 comrades. It really was remarkable. They really did create this escape line, and they really did save many, many Allied servicemen. Often, well, in several cases, breaking them out of a military hospital in the town of Doullens, which is about an hour north of Paris, breaking them out and then literally hiding them in the trunk of their car, where they drove through Nazi checkpoints back to Paris, back to their apartment, where they sheltered them. And there were some just amazing escapades. Perhaps that's too light a term for what it was, but these were sort of terrifying. The thing about their car, Kate owned a car that was a Peugeot 420, and it had an unusual feature to it, which is that the trunk was not in the back of the car. It was actually beneath the rear seats of the car, so that it couldn't actually be seen from the outside. And Kate, who was really sort of the prime mover of the duo, had figured out that if a man could sort of scrunch himself up, he could just barely fit into this trunk and would not necessarily be seen from the outside. So that's what they did. They hid them in the trunk of their car. On one occasion, in fact, they had a guy whose name was Gordon Hood Cree. He was a corporal in the British Army, and they had him in the trunk of their car. He had been very badly wounded. He had shrapnel in his leg, so he was in a lot of pain. He had trouble walking, but he managed to get into the car. This was a very hot day in August and of 1940, and he's in this sort of metal box beneath the rear seats of the car, and everything is going fine. They're driving back to Paris. And then suddenly they get pulled over by two Nazi officers who saw them coming down the road and pulled them over. Well, it turns out that these Nazi officers needed to get to the next town, and there weren't many cars on the road, and they basically asked Kate, who was driving, if she would take them to the next town. Um, and what could she do? She couldn't really say no. And so she agreed. And the two men, the two Nazi officers, got into the back seat of the car, directly above where this escaped British prisoner of war was hiding in the trunk. Well, Etta said that her heart was in her mouth. She could barely speak. She was so scared about what was going to happen. Kate, who was much cooler, kept on driving and managed to sort of keep the conversation going with the Nazi officers so that they wouldn't notice any sounds coming from directly beneath them. And eventually she did drop them off at their location, and they continued on down the road, and all continued on well until they got to the outskirts of Paris, at which point there was the sound of a shot. And Etta said, "Are we being shot at?" And Kate said, "No, one of our tires just blew out." And they had to stop the car and try to put a new spare tire on the car, which was very difficult to do because there was a 200 some pound man in the trunk weighting it down, and they couldn't do it. And eventually he had to actually get out of the trunk and fix the tire. And in fact, a Nazi officer came over to inquire whether they needed help while he was doing that. So that was a very close call. But they did this time and again. And ultimately, they managed to create, with the help of several other people, including a priest in the small French village by the name of Conchy-sur-Conche, who knew where English prisoners of war were hiding in the woods. These were the men who had been kind of left behind and had not been able to get out during the evacuation from Dunkirk, and they were basically just living in the woods in huts and lean-tos that they built for themselves. Sometimes they were being sheltered by farm families who were sympathetic. And he would collect them and bring them down to Paris. And from there, Etta and Kate would get fake identity cards for them and put them on trains, and the trains would take them west to a town called Libourne, which was right on the line of demarcation that separated occupied France from unoccupied France. And from there, they would meet a peasant who Kate had managed to locate, whose name was Elie Tessier, and he would bring them down in his little boat down the river Dordogne, and then he would walk them across on foot across the line of demarcation, and from there they would take a train down to Marseille, the very southern coast of France, where they could get a ship back to England. Now I should mention that Kate and Etta were, as I mentioned, older women who were retired. They had 3 Cocker Spaniels who they took care of together. They lived a very conventional life in Paris, and they had been since Etta had moved there in 1937 from New York. Her husband, whom she had been married to since she was quite young, had just died, and Kate, who had a big apartment in Paris, she was recently separated from her husband. We should all have this kind of problem of having an apartment in Paris that was too big. And so she invited Etta to come live with her, and the two of them lived together for 3 peaceful years until the occupation of 1940, walking their dogs in the Parc Monceau and the Bois de Bouillon, and shopping at the bouquinistes, the booksellers along the Seine, and shopping in the local markets. And Kate was quite a good cook. And, they had a small circle of friends. Uh, so they were very similar in that way. They were both very cultured. They loved to read, go to the movies, and so forth. But they were very different temperamentally, which is important to understand. Etta was American. Etta was from New York City. And in fact, she had lived a remarkably sheltered life up until that point. In fact, she had never lived her entire life outside a 5 square block radius of the Upper East Side of New York City. It's where she was born, where she had grown up, and where she continued to live with her husband. She had not worked since she was married, I think at the age of 21 or 22. She had been a teacher for just a year. Um, and her life was entirely routinized. And the reason for that is that she was an exceptionally anxious person. She was afflicted with anxiety her whole life. She was overweight. She had high blood pressure, which I'm sure didn't help with her anxiety. The anxiety didn't help with her blood pressure. And this sort of routine had been a way for her to kind of manage her anxiety. And her husband had kind of taken care of her while they were living together. And then after he died, she moved to Paris and lived with Kate. Kate, on the other hand, was very different. Kate was English. She was an English woman who had been married to a Frenchman. Uh, they had separated very, very amicably. They continued to remain friends. She was someone who was exceptionally independent minded and had been ever since she was young. She had come from an upper class British family, had been trained, in a girls' private school, and as a young woman, she had done the sort of one conventional thing in her life. She married the proper man, from who a solicitor from a few towns over, um, and she married him, and the two of them moved to Rome because he got a post at the British consulate in Rome. And I discovered in my research that a couple of years after that, he, the husband, returned to England without her. She remained in Rome. And I was very curious about that. Why was it that she remained in Rome when her husband returned to England? Well, eventually I discovered that, in point of fact, she was about to have a child. And she did have a child in Rome, not by her husband, but by her Italian lover, her unmarried Italian lover. Her son Leonardo was born as a bastard, as was said in those days. And she continued to uh, maintain her relationship with this man until he died in 1918 of the Spanish flu, during the Spanish flu pandemic, at which point she moved to Paris with her young son and set up her own business. She took a shop, a dress shop in Paris. This itself was very unusual for a woman in France at that time. Women were not allowed to control their own money. They were not able to have bank accounts that were not co-signed by a man. In the meantime, she then divorced her British husband, which again, very unusual for a British woman of that time to A, get divorced at all, and B, to initiate the divorce, and then to have her own business. She owned and drove her own car. Again, very unusual in Paris in the 1920s, 1930s. She actually drove ambulances during the war. So she was a very strong-minded, unconventional woman and very, very patriotic. She was really an English patriot. So that was Etta and Kate, but I didn't know who their comrades were. Eventually, I discovered, a researcher of mine in France discovered in a folder in a military archive in a town called Caen, C-A-E-N, Caen, France, the actual Nazi judgment against Etta and Kate. They were eventually arrested 3 months after the beginning of this escape line and were put on trial and for aid to the enemy. And this judgment gave their real names and ages, along with the real names and occupations and ages of their 6 co-defendants. And that was the first time that I was really able to understand who all of these people really were in real life, and to then be able to delve more deeply into what was really going on there. I should mention that this was going on in the year 2020, which you all remember was the time of the pandemic. So I couldn't get into the New York Public Library, which is my local library. I knew that there was information in there that I could use, but I literally couldn't get in. Uh, I couldn't get on a plane to go to Paris or to go to London or other places where this information was held. And so eventually I created a kind of network of my own of researchers. I had 4 researchers in France and two in England and 2 in Italy and 1 in Germany. And one of these folks in France found this judgment, and that enabled me to then begin to really delve into the real lives of who these people were, who had, along with Kate and Etta, had risked their own safety and indeed risked their lives to try to save these English servicemen. And then through the work of a genealogist in England, I was able to identify the names of the real names of the English servicemen whom they had sheltered in their apartment and whom they had saved. But here is where we come to the problem that eventually I encountered. And this was really the turning point for me with my understanding of this story, because there was an aspect of Etta's memoir that I couldn't quite get my mind around, and it was very troubling to me. It was actually the precipitating incident of the whole story. It was the most famous incident in the book. It was the one that when the Reader's Digest excerpted the book, this was the scene that they excerpted. It was mentioned in all of the reviews of this book. And according to this, according to Etta's memoir, on June 13th, 1940, as the Nazis were coming in to Paris, just on the outskirts of Paris, Etta and Kate, like much of the rest of Paris, took to the road, fleeing the oncoming Nazi armies. And they went down, again, according to the memoir, to a town south of Paris called Orléans, where they stopped briefly at an inn to get some food for their dogs, their 3 Cocker Spaniels. And while they were there, the innkeeper kind of rushed out and said, you know, mesdames, do you speak English? Because there's someone here who shouldn't be here. And he was quite distraught. And it turned out that this person who wasn't supposed to be there was a British RAF pilot who had been trapped behind enemy lines and had been unable to get out and was about to be captured by the Nazis. His name, the pseudonym given to him in the book, was William Gray. And according to Etta's memoir, at that moment, sort of on impulse, these two women decided that they were going to save him or try to save him. And they bundled him up into the trunk of their car and drove back that night to Paris, crossing through Nazi checkpoints with him in the trunk of the car to get back to their apartment. Well, I knew that his name was not William Gray because all of the characters in the book had pseudonyms, but I didn't know his real name. So I was trying to find out who he really was. And as much as I looked, I couldn't find out what his real identity was. Um, it just didn't make sense to me. There were a number of details about this that didn't add up. Um, I searched military histories. I searched newspaper accounts. I searched all kinds of prisoner testimonies and so forth. I couldn't find any indication about this William Gray. And this was very troubling to me because I thought, as a historian, how am I going to be able to write a book about uh, about this story when I don't really know the incident that set it all into motion? Because that was the beginning of the escape line. Um, well, little by little, I began to seriously wonder if I was ever going to figure out who this guy was, or even if he existed at all, frankly. And eventually, what happened was that after a period of time, I received a packet of letters from Etta Shiber's grandniece. Etta Shiber was a very conscientious and diligent, faithful letter writer. And she would write regular letters, quite long, back to her brother and her sister in law, who lived in upstate New York, in Syracuse, in the months immediately preceding and then immediately following the German occupation of Paris. Um, and when I read these letters, which were wonderful, it became clear to me that, in point of fact, they hadn't gone down to Orleans to meet where they encountered this pilot named William Gray. In fact, they had gone west to the western part, to Brittany, to the western part of France, and they hadn't returned that night. They had stayed there for 2.5 weeks before returning to Paris, like most of the rest of the city. And that none of what had been described in this memoir regarding William Gray was in fact true, that in fact it had been made up. And I realized that, well, if that scene was made up, the precipitating incident of the book, then the very next wonderful scene, the scene where there's a surprise inspection of their apartment by the Gestapo, and they have to dress up the pilot, William Gray, to look like Etta's dead brother, to fool the Gestapo. That couldn't have happened either because there was no William Gray. And then the scene after that couldn't have happened as well. And at a certain point, I began to wonder how much of this really did happen. How much of this book really is true? I knew some of it was true because I had confirmed it independently. But this book, this wonderful memoir that I had worried I was going to be too dependent on this memoir, and that my book was really just going to be a gloss on that memoir and basically saying, read this book. This book is really great. That now I realize this was an entirely undependable or unreliable resource. Well, this was the moment at which I began to wonder, am I going to have to return my advance to my publisher? Because I didn't know what to do. I had a hole in my narrative that I could not figure out. And this was a very dark period. And one day I was talking about this with a friend of mine who's a writer, and she told me that she had studied fiction writing at NYU with the great novelist E.L. Doctorow, whom I adore. I love his work. And one day in class, E.L. Doctorow had said to his students, if you ever find that you have a hole in your narrative that you can't figure out, don't run away from that hole. point to the whole. And I was fascinated by that because it's so counterintuitive. Like, why would a writer want to point to a hole in their narrative? Would want to alert a reader to a hole in their narrative. Um, but there was something in there that I thought was really fascinating that I wanted to explore. And ultimately, it became clear to me that the story of this memoir, Paris Underground, and how it had been published, and why it had been published in this particular way, was actually part and parcel of the whole story. And that in fact, you could not understand what had really happened between Etta and Kate during the war and then after the war without confronting what had really happened with the publication of this memoir. And once I realized that, the structure of my book sort of fell into place. Because what I discovered was that there was a great deal in that memoir that wasn't true. There were errors of commission and errors of omission. For instance, it was said in the memoir that they had saved 150 servicemen. And in fact, which is a lot for 3 months. And in some of the publicity material for the book, that number itself got inflated, and it was said that they had saved 200 servicemen. And later on, it became 250 servicemen. Well, I discovered that they had saved 20 servicemen, 20 English servicemen, and about the same number of French servicemen, which is a lot, but it's not 150. And clearly, the publisher had decided if 20 is good, 150 is even better. And so that wasn't true. And there were a number of other incidents in the book that, in point of fact, did not happen. There's also, interestingly and importantly, an error of omission in the book, which I discovered to my surprise, which is the fact that Etta Shiber was Jewish, as I discovered. Now, this is never mentioned in the book, the fact that Etta Shiber was Jewish. But as I discovered, Etta Shiber came from a German immigrant family. Her family hailed originally from Alsace, from a town called Eggelsheim in Alsace that had a Jewish community there since the 14th century. Her grandmother had been born in the Jewish hospital of Eggelsheim. Etta's maiden name was Henrietta Kahn Shiber. Her brother, actually her cousin, who was called her brother in the book, but was really her cousin, was named Irving Weil, W-E-I-L, another Jewish name. And then eventually I spoke with Etta's niece, who said, yes, Etta was in fact Jewish on both sides of her family. Now, this was never mentioned in the book, Paris Underground. In fact, there were only 4 mentions of Jewishness at all in a lengthy book that is set in Nazi-occupied Paris. Now, you would think that the publisher would want to mention the fact that Etta was doing all of this as a Jewish woman, because that raises the stakes about what she was doing, that she was doing this as a Jew, and yet they never do. And the reason why they didn't, as it turns out, is because they were hoping to sell a lot of copies of the book. And so what they were trying to do was to turn Etta into a kind of all-American figure who Americans of all stripes could relate to. So they turned her into a kind of old, naive, unsophisticated, all-American type person who, as they said, would be comfortable sitting in a rocking chair on a country porch, as opposed to the woman who she really was, who was a German Jew from New York City who lived with her gay cousin, who was the leading classical music critic of New York, and who she herself liked to read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and had worked as a younger woman at the workers' school in New York that gave free education to the children of the poor, and was actually a far more progressive and complicated person than the image that was created for her in this book. The reason being that, as many of you probably know, in 1942, support for the war in America was a little bit iffy, and the actual outcome of the war was very much still in doubt. And the Roosevelt administration, among others, wanted to maintain a clear dividing line between American interests and so-called Jewish interests. And they wanted to not at all give the idea that American boys were dying for Jews. And in fact, Jewish organizations tried to kind of soft pedal their support for the war because they didn't want to create the impression that this was a Jewish war. And you see that sort of replicated in the story of this book. Because in fact, as I discovered, and I'll finish with this, Etta Shiber did not write this memoir, in fact. Etta Shiber, this book was written, well, the title page of the book says, by Etta Shiber with Paul and Anne Dupre. Well, Paul and Anne Dupre also don't exist. They were pseudonyms for Paul and Elizabeth Winkler, who were very, Paul especially, very powerful. He was a very powerful literary agent and publisher. And he had gone to Etta and said, he had heard about her, and he said, I would like to turn your story into a book, and I will pay you money for this, and I will make your friend Kitty out to be a great heroine. And Etta, somewhat reluctantly at first, agreed to do it. And she was interviewed by Winkler's staff for a long period of time. But they were not the authors either. The real author, as I discovered, was a man by the name of Alidor Farkas, who was a Hungarian Jewish immigrant from France, actually, who had been living in France, who came to the United States and wrote this book. But as I discovered at the end of my research, Alidor Farkas had intended his book to be a novel, not a work of nonfiction, not a memoir. He had used Etta's interviews as the basis for what he intended to be a novel. And ultimately, he sued the publisher, which was Charles Scribner's and Sons, because he had received no credit for the book. So he sued for money and for credit. And as part of that suit, he had written a quite lengthy affidavit in which he described in great detail the process by which he had written this novel, and included, itemized 17 characters whom he had made up for the story. The very first one of which was William Gray, the supposed RAF pilot. So my supposition was confirmed. And in the course of this affidavit, Alidor Farkas says that a fraud has been perpetrated against the American people because this was published as nonfiction rather than as fiction. And the ultimate consequence of this is that in 1943, when the book comes out, it's a huge hit. As I mentioned earlier, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for 18 weeks. It sold 500,000 copies. And it succeeded in the sense that it boosted American support for the war. It did accomplish that. Um, but when it came out in 1943, no one knew what had become of Kitty, of Kate Bonnefous. She had been arrested and sentenced by the Nazis and had been disappeared. She had become one of the so-called night and fog prisoners, the political prisoners whom Hitler considered to be the most dangerous, and she had disappeared somewhere into German occupied territory, and no one knew exactly where. And in fact, when this book came out, no one, including Etta, knew even if Kate was still alive or not. Well, as I've discovered, she was very much alive. She was in a prison camp in Silesia that was known as Yaur. And when that book came out, it was excerpted, among other places, for 5 straight days in the pages of the Daily Mail, the most widely read newspaper in England. And the Nazis read that book and they believed that book because at the front of the book, there is a statement from the publisher, everything in this book is true. And they knew who they had. They knew who Kate Bonnefous was because they knew who Etta Shiber had been on trial with. And they knew, so now they knew who they had or who they thought they had. They thought they had a woman who had saved not 20, but 150 British soldiers, along with all of the other things that were attributed to her in this book. And as a result of that, they tortured her to get this additional information, which she did not have because it didn't exist. And ultimately, they sentenced her to death for a second time, actually. Fortunately, that sentence was never carried out. Eventually, Kate managed to survive the war quite remarkably. And at the end of the war in 1945, she now weighs 70 pounds. She's lost all of her teeth because they had been knocked out by the Nazis as part of this torture with jailers' keys that had knocked out her teeth. She returns to Paris and she's given a copy of this book, which is dedicated to her, to Kitty. She reads it. And the very next day, and I discovered this on a piece of paper on a folder that is held in the National Archives and Research Administration in Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. And when I first read it, I couldn't quite comprehend what it meant. She read the book, and the very next day, she went to the British Embassy in Paris to inquire about the possibility of suing her friend Etta Shiber for the damage that had been done to her and to her comrades as a result of the publication of this book. So what initially I had thought was simply a story of courage and daring and resistance is all of that. And yet at the same time, where ultimately it becomes, I think, a larger and more complex and interesting story about all of those things, but also about friendship and about betrayal and about unseen consequences and means and ends and a number of other things. As well as, and I think that this was true when I first began writing this or researching this book at the beginning of 2020, and is even more true today. Here we are in 2025, a story about two seemingly ordinary women who find the inner resources to resist fascism when it is on the horizon, who sense the arrival of deepening injustice and scapegoating and find it within themselves to resist. Etta Shiber was an imperfect person but she was heroic in her own way. She was a Jewish heroine whom we had never known of until now. So I'm delighted to have written this book. I'm delighted by the response that it's gotten thus far. I'm delighted that you're here tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible lecture, and thank you to the audience for submitting questions. We have some already, which I'll ask, but also just a reminder, if anyone has lingering questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to all of them if we can. We have quite a few questions actually about your research process for this book. I'll kind of combine some questions that are pretty similar. Um, a few people have commented on the incredible fact that you found out, most of this Paris underground memoir was actually fiction or, embellished. So some people are asking, throughout the research process for the entire book, how did you go about determining what was 100% true fact and what was fiction? And were there ever moments where you were unsure and kind of not sure how to figure out what was what?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. As I mentioned, not uh, everything in the book is fiction by any means. I would say
Hmm.
probably, I never really stopped to think about it, but probably most of the material in the book is true, more or
Hmm.
less. The prisons that she was in, she really was in. The dates that she was in these prisons, she really was
Hmm.
in these prisons. I should mention that she was returned to the United States after 18 months
Hmm.
uh, in Nazi prisons. She was exchanged for a German female spy by the name of Johanna Hoffman. So it was a prisoner
Hmm.
exchange, and she was returned to New York in June of 1942. She had had 3 heart attacks while
Oh.
she was in prison. She was in very ill health. Um, so um, I felt that I could only include information from the memoir if I
Hmm.
had independent confirmation of it
Right.
from somewhere else,
Hmm.
uh, whether that might be newspaper accounts,
Hmm.
prisoner testimonies. One of the really great resources for someone doing this kind of work is in the National Archives in London, the military archives.
Hmm.
Um, Anytime a British prisoner managed to escape from the Nazis in World War II, when they got back to England, they were immediately interrogated by an officer of the MI5, the British
Hmm.
intelligence service, to find out how they had managed to escape, because they're a great source of information.
Hmm.
They can say how they escaped, which French citizens helped them along the way, whether they had seen any German military installations during their escape, and so forth.
Hmm.
So there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these essentially oral testimonies that were given by prisoners, in which they say who had helped them along
Hmm.
the way. So these were, among other things, enormous sources of help for me
Hmm.
in terms of trying to figure out exactly how the escape line worked and who it was that they had managed to rescue. Um, I want to say one other thing, if I can, along those
Hmm.
lines. Um, a great deal of the materials that I was working with for this book were in French. I would say at least half of the materials were in French, whether they were oral histories, whether they were histories of individual villages,
Hmm.
military histories, military records, whatever it might be. They were mainly in French. Now, I happen to read French, not as well as,
Hmm.
of course, as I read English, so it took me a little bit longer. But one of the things that I'm very pleased about was that there were a number of oral histories that were given by the other prisoners who were
Hmm.
with Kate in the Nazi prison camps. And
Hmm.
the entire final section of the book is a recapitulation by me, a recreation
Mm-hmm.
of Kate's life after her um, her judgment by the Nazi military tribunal, and then what happened to her. She was not in a concentration camp. She was in a prison camp with other political prisoners, women
Mm-hmm.
political prisoners, and these were just remarkable women. I mean, women of incredible strength, incredible commitment, incredible discipline, genuine heroines. And many of them gave accounts of their imprisonment after the war, but they were all in French and they've never appeared in English before. So
Mm-hmm.
I was very happy to be able to give some account of their stories. I'll just mention one in
Mm-hmm.
particular, the account of the so-called death march of the women of Yaur.
Mm-hmm.
Yaur was the name of the final prison that Kate was in. This astonishing march that hundreds of women made in the bitter winter in Poland through cold that was like 30 degrees below zero, where they
Mm-hmm.
marched for weeks in summer clothes and high heels. And it's an astonishing story of survival. And it's never appeared, as far as I know, it has never appeared in English before. So I was very pleased to be able
Mm-hmm.
to tell the story of the death march of the women of Yaur, um, in my book.
Well, thank you for that answer. And you actually got to another question, which was, do you speak French? And did that help?
I
Which
sort of
makes
do. I
sense.
mean, French is tough.
Yeah.
I can get by. Yeah, I can get by. And I did research in France, and I went to their
Mm-hmm.
apartments where they lived. But most of my research for France had to do with reading French
Right.
books. A lot of things are very specific. Histories of particular units, or
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. Particular, the Holocaust in X region of France and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I was reading a lot of that,
Right. Sure.
and also these oral testimonies, which are
Mm-hmm.
held in French museums, places like the Museum of the Resistance in
Right.
France, and so forth, that are just quite astounding.
Sure. Thank you. We have a couple other questions about your research process. One in particular, um, mentions how you talked about how you were researching during COVID, which of course brought its own slew of problems that you had to find solutions for. They're wondering if any of these kind of solutions or new techniques that you developed because of COVID, if you've taken any of them with you into your work now that we're, sort of post-COVID, or at least post a lot of the restrictions.
Well, it's funny. I had never made use of researchers
Hmm.
before with any of my books. I always felt that I wanted to be the one to to be looking at these documents,
Hmm.
because I knew what it was that I was interested in. And sometimes you see something and that leads you in a particular direction that maybe a researcher wouldn't necessarily anticipate, and so forth.
Hmm.
So I've never used researchers, but I was forced to in this case.
Hmm.
And I have to say, I'm just so deeply indebted to them. Every single one of them were terrific in their own way. I acknowledge them, fulsomely in the acknowledgments of the book. Um, and in particular, in Italy and Germany, where I really don't
Hmm.
speak the language at all, I was, like for instance, the information that I mentioned about Kate's, um, the birth, like the birth
Hmm.
of her son. Ultimately, one of my researchers in Italy found the actual church record,
Wow.
that of the birth to a single woman, to an unmarried
Hmm.
woman, I think it said. And I never would have been able to find that.
Right.
So I was utterly dependent on them. Um, so I have not begun researching anything else at this point.
Hmm.
But I certainly would be more inclined to
Hmm.
use researchers than I have in the past. I should also mention, by way of thanks, that I did get a lot of help from the families
Hmm.
of the servicemen. All of the servicemen, I spoke to their
Hmm.
children and grandchildren,
Mhm.
um, widows, and so forth.
Mhm.
And in the case of Etta, I mentioned the letters that I received
Mhm.
from her grandniece. And in terms of Kate, Kate had a son, and that son in turn had two sons who were
Mhm.
Kate's grandsons. And they're quite elderly now, but one of them lives in France and one of them lives in Portugal. They
Mhm.
don't speak English very well, but they were quite happy to talk to me about their
Mhm.
grandmother, whom they adored, and who took actually a lot of care of them when they were young.
Mhm.
Um, and one of them, whose name is Eric Sales, who lives in Portugal, is exactly the guy who every researcher wants to
Mhm.
find, which is the family records keeper, right?
Right.
So he had all of Kate's stuff,
Wow.
that he had her address book from years ago with the names and phone numbers and addresses of her contacts in it. He
Mhm.
had the news clippings that she had saved. He had all of her medical records, which were incredibly useful. He had handwritten notes that she had made, um, for the claim that she made against the German government in 1962. In 1962, the German and British governments agreed on on restitution for victims of Nazi terror, and you had to
Mhm.
apply for that. And to do that, you had to give an account um, of what your victimization was. So that was very helpful to me because I did find that claim. But she made handwritten notes for that claim,
Mhm.
in her own handwriting, which were again part of his papers, and photographs and so forth. So that was enormously helpful to me as well. So for all
Mhm.
researchers out there, family
Mhm.
members are enormously helpful, which you can find through, ancestry.com and genealogists and so forth. They're a great resource.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left, hopefully, I think time for a couple more questions. I'll ask you a couple that are not about your research process and more about sort of the reception of the Paris Underground memoir. Someone is wondering if you were able to um, find out how Etta's family or her descendants felt about the erasure of certain aspects of her identity in the memoir, particularly her Jewishness.
That's an excellent question. I don't actually know the answer to that. Etta
Hmm.
never had any children.
Right.
So there were no children for me to ask about that or grandchildren. Um, I spoke to her niece and to her grandniece.
Hmm.
Um, and they actually, it's funny, I don't recall that they ever mentioned that,
Hmm.
in particular. Um, but I will say that, Etta never spoke about the memoir,
Hmm.
and the information that was in the memoir. And she died only a few years after the book came out. As I mentioned, she had been in ill health. She died at age 70. Um, and a question that I often get from readers is, did the two of them ever meet
Hmm.
again after the war? And as far as I can tell, I can't swear to this, but as far as I can tell, the answer is no.
Hmm.
I did find, again, among the effects in Portugal and um, in Eric's possession, and this was kind of in a way like a holy grail kind of relic.
Hmm.
I found the long letter the long handwritten letter written from a hotel in the Catskills,
Wow.
that Etta wrote to Kate when she found out that Kate was still alive.
Hmm.
Um, a page of which is, I think, reproduced in the book.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a very long, lovely letter in which she says, "Did you read the book?"
Hmm.
Um, and as far as I can tell, Kate never responded to that
Wow.
letter. Kate did get in touch quite quickly with a number of the people she was close to upon her return, her son, her brother, her
Hmm.
attorney, and so forth,
Hmm.
but not Etta. By the time Etta found out that Kate had been liberated, It was already 4 months later, and Kate had not been in touch with her all of that time. And again, the only way to really understand that is to understand the consequences of this publication.
Mm. Well, thank you. I think we're right at 8, so excellent job at finishing right on time. And you actually answered the last question I was going to ask, which was, did they ever meet again?